Hello there, this is talkTV, live from the Talk Radio studio this morning. Thank you for your company. We'll be in Iran, or we'll talking about Iran, before 4 this morning. Protests continue in that part of the world after the death of a woman at the hands of the so-called morality police. It's a really big and important conversation about human rights, but particularly and specifically women's rights in Iran in the last couple of days. We'll get to that shortly on talkTV. Firstly, to Ukraine, where a referendum is underway in the east of the country, if you can describe it as that. We've heard some examples and some stories of Russian soldiers taking Ukrainians at gunpoint to vote in that referendum as to whether or not those people living in that part of the region, in that part of the country, want to live under Russian rule. It's fair to say that it will not be treated by the international community as a legitimate vote. Let's speak to Jamil Jaffer now, who is a founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at the George Mason University in Washington, who can give us a bit more insight into how that's playing out, the international response, and a couple of other bits and bobs to get into as well, Jamil, if that's all right with you. Let's start there, though, with that referendum. What are we hearing from that part of the country at the moment?
Well, Daryl, one of the challenges here is that Vladimir Putin, in a public speech, called for referendums to take place. He indicated that Russia intends to annex those parts of Ukraine if, in fact, the referendums go that way. And now you've got Russian troops in Luhansk, Donetsk, in Zaporizhia, in Kherson, essentially taking people to the polls, ensuring they vote the right way. We saw a referendum in Crimea just a few days ago where 97% of the population voted for Russian annexation. Obviously not what you would call a free and fair vote.
Yeah, and I saw a tweet, I think, the other day that said something along the lines of, if you're marched at gunpoint, then if you're feeling suicidal, you might vote against Russian occupation in that part of the world. What has the international response been to this? I mean, we've heard, I think, from some G7 leaders in the last couple of days or so, haven't we, Jamil? What are they saying?
Right. I mean, the phrase that the G7 leadership and the U.S. leadership is using is the word sham, right? And that's exactly right. These are sham elections. These are real elections. Look, there are Russian-speaking populations in certain parts, in Luhansk and Donetsk, but the reality is that these were always parts of the country that were a core part of Ukraine. And so this idea somehow that now they want to be part of Russia, that they've broken away, this is all a narrative created by Vladimir Putin in the lead up to the war as an excuse to go to war, and now an excuse to retain that part of the territory and keep that land between the mainland of Russia and Crimea, which they annexed back in 2014.
How do we... Let's talk about how the international community sort of combats this issue in this moment. There is something about tanks rolling over the border in Ukraine, and us seeing clear examples of war crimes in some instances that make it very easy and very straightforward for us to sort of point the finger at what's going on, show those images and understand it and counter it. When it comes to something like this, and for all of the stories we're hearing about people being marched at gunpoint to vote in this, and that term sham being used, and this clearly not being a legitimate election, it becomes a little bit more complicated, doesn't it? When Vladimir Putin will eventually turn around and say, look, there is a democratic process that we've gone through here and the people of Ukraine have spoken. That becomes a different sort of type of war to try to fight, doesn't it?
It does. It makes it much more difficult. And part of this challenge here is how do we explain and how do we demonstrate that the narrative that Vladimir Putin has created is false? One of the things the Biden administration, I think, deserves some credit for is the public outing, using intelligence information to describe what the Russians plan to do in the lead up to the invasion, the fact that they plan to sort of gin up an excuse to go in. And I think we'd like to see more of that here. We'd like to see actual sort of evidence demonstrating that these aren't real elections, that the Russians are ginning this up. But you're exactly right, Daryl. It is much harder to argue that, Putin needs to get out when he can point to a vote, a fake vote, though it may have been. He can point to a vote that gives him and gives Russia, some sort of legitimacy in annexing those countries, which, to be clear, they don't have any legitimacy when it comes to those issues.
How does it change the dynamic of the physical war in that part of the world as well?
Well, we've seen some great gains by the Ukrainian forces up in Kharkiv, in the eastern part of the country, coming up towards Donetsk. So those were really positive advances. We've seen some smaller advances down in Kherson, although the Russians seem to have consolidated their forces there. We now know that Vladimir Putin is calling up 300,000 reservists. Something he had tried to avoid doing. A problem that I think that he's going to feels like will cause some problems at home. But he's doing it. He's made clear that it's his view that if these areas view themselves as part of Russia or claim to view themselves as part of Russia, and he annexes them, that he might be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend them. Now, of course, that's a bridge too far for everyone. President Biden has made that clear. European leaders have made that clear. Although the problem is, right, one of the things President Biden said when he said don't use nuclear weapons, he said, well, our response will depend on what Russia does. And of course, that's not the kind of response you want to have. What you want to say is, look, it's a red line. You cross it. We're coming in. We're pushing you completely out of Ukraine, and there'll be even more consequences to pay. We haven't said that. The European leaders haven't said that. So Vladimir Putin may think he's got a little bit of room to run.
In so much as, I mean, there's a big question here, isn't there, and a big conversation about whether or not Vladimir Putin would or will use nuclear weapons. But so much as he may be emboldened to feel as though he has more room between where he is now and the use of nuclear weapons.
Daryl, that's exactly right. I think it's highly unlikely that Vladimir Putin actually intends to use tactical nuclear weapons. There's been a lot of talk. Europeans seem to think he might. President Biden clearly thinks there's some intelligence reporting to suggest he might. My view is he won't, but you're exactly right. It makes the situation more dangerous. It shows if he's got a lot of room to run. Right? If we're talking about the scope of nuclear weapons, that means he can do almost anything he wants to civilians. We've already seen wanton killing, wanton direct attacking of schools and apartment buildings. We're likely to see more of that as he tries to extract a larger cost from the Ukrainian people. That's bad for us. That's bad for our European allies, and it's bad for Ukraine in particular.
Of course, there's a complicated question about how these things are taken in Russia, and they are how they are received in Russia and how they're reported in Russia. We'll come on in a minute to the sort of protests that we've seen in St. Petersburg and Moscow. On specifically the issue of a nuclear threat, to hear your leader, to sort of hear your leader make a case for what he is describing as a noble intervention into a part of the world, into Ukraine, overrun with Nazis. You can sort of understand, or you can see perhaps the path that some Russians have taken to believing that is the right thing to do, although of course we know it isn't. When it comes to hearing them talk about nuclear weapons, though, it is possible, isn't it, that those hearts and minds that Putin is trying to win in Russia aren't won by that, and perhaps see that as being an escalation too far. It's a risky game in his own country, isn't it?
It is absolutely a risky game in his own country. It's a risky game when it comes to Europeans and Americans because, look, this is a situation that's never happened in world history. We've seen the use of nuclear weapons in anger only twice, both by the United States, both to try to end the war against Japan in Asia. We haven't seen that happen since. So if this were to happen, it would be a dramatic change in operations. It may lose him support at home. He's already going to be calling up these 300,000 troops. He knows that's not going to be popular. We already see lines of Russian men trying to exit the country, trying to escape before they're called up. So this could really weaken his support at home. And, look, Vladimir Putin's got some concerns. We know that he had a purge of some of his KGB leaders early on in his conflict for fear that they might rise up against him. We have seen some talk in Russia about the problems in this war on public television. And so that is a problem that Vladimir Putin really may face going forward.
We also, I think, one of his logistics chiefs fired yesterday as well, I think. So there are clear signs of unrest, aren't there, and clear signs of perhaps frustration on his part, as you would expect. I imagine playing into that is the response in Russia to the drafting process that has been initiated by the Russian regime. We've seen protests, haven't we, in Moscow and St. Petersburg?
That's right. We see street protests. We see folks lining up at the borders. We see people trying to get out. This was never going to be a popular position. Vladimir Putin knows it. It's why he stayed away from it for so long. It's why he's taken some significant losses in Ukraine without going to this call-up. He also knows it's going to take him time, right? You call up 300,000 troops. They have to be trained. They have to be housed. And they have to be put into the fight. You can't just take them off the streets and put them into the fight. And so, in a lot of ways, the dynamic of this war may change even before these troops get fielded, and the unpopular at home may cause them real problems. Putin's been able to sort of skate at home by shaping the narrative there. Now he can't really avoid the fact that he needs these troops because he's called them up. That will suggest to Russian people it's not going as well as they have been led to believe.
What kind of future do those people face? Those people who've protested?
It's well, not a good one, unfortunately. Look, protesting in Russia against a person who himself gets 96% of the vote regularly is not going to be popular in the sense that it's going to cause a reaction against them, right? The KGB, the FSB, the former KGB, the FSB now, and the SVR are very effective at home. And that's a real problem for those people. And so while we do see Russian protests and the like, these people are doing it at the risk of their lives.
Here in Europe as well, we're also seeing another sort of remarkable story, Jamil, play out in Italy. We might talk about this a little bit later on after 4 o'clock tonight. There is a vote happening in Italy at the moment that looks set to elect a very far-right government there. We've also heard from the former Prime Minister in Italy, Berlusconi, who's defended Vladimir Putin and defended Russia. The election of a government in Italy that has links to Vladimir Putin, that perhaps has been not quite, that's been perhaps in some instances supportive of Vladimir Putin, it puts a fox in the chicken coop, doesn't it, so far as Europe is concerned in its response to this war? How do you see that playing out in the next couple of weeks, days, months?
It is a real potential issue, but we've already seen some of the fox in the henhouse challenge with Turkey, right? Turkey, a NATO ally, has been now buying S-400s from Russia. Those aren't systems that are compatible with NATO systems. Now, of course, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has his own problems with Vladimir Putin. But that relationship and the building of relationships that Putin has been effective at doing is a real challenge for the United States and our allies and our European allies. You look at what Putin has done in the global south, you don't see a lot of real reaction against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which you would expect. And unfortunately, they've been kept happy with Vladimir Putin, getting these grain supplies out of Ukraine. He's not doing that to benefit Ukraine, to be clear. He's doing that because he doesn't want to lose support in the global south, which has largely stayed quiet. The Europeans, the Americans, our allies in Southeast Asia have been supportive of our intervention in Ukraine and our supplying of weapons. But largely, a lot of other countries around the world have stayed quiet in ways they should not have. And Vladimir Putin is very interested in keeping that support, and any cracks he can make in the European effort is going to be very helpful to him. You'll also see him using heating gas and oil in the wintertime to really try and break the resolve of the folks in Europe.
And do you think this has to change, Jamil, the response that other European leaders have to this victory in Italy for this far right? We would sort of accurately describe them as a far right political party. In so much as a political leader wins an election in a European country, they get a phone call from everybody. Emmanuel Macron will be on the phone, and Liz Truss here in the United Kingdom will be on the phone, and Biden will be on the phone, no doubt, to congratulate them, to sort of welcome them to the fold and welcome them to the table. A party like Brothers of Italy doing well in Italy with links to Ukraine, does that have to change the way in which other European and Western leaders greet them?
Well, I think they have to account for the fact of who may get elected in Italy. But look, at the end of the day, democratic elections are what they are. We've got to cope with them and deal with them, and that's what the people of Italy want, so be it. But what it makes us realize is that what we really ought to have done have been more effective in Ukraine and really have pushed back and frankly deterred this conflict instead of letting it go where it's gone. That's on all the leaders in Europe. It's on Joe Biden himself. It's on, everyone, frankly, since 2014, when we didn't effectively respond to the first invasion of Ukraine, and our failure to enforce the Syria Red Line and so on and so forth, our failures to really push back on China and Taiwan. The Russians watch this. The Chinese watch this. We cannot continue to be weak-kneed against our adversaries and expect that they won't take advantage of that. And so while the elections in Italy are important, what European leadership really ought to take from what's happening in Ukraine and what American leadership ought to take from what's happening in Taiwan is that when you stand up for your allies and you make your adversaries fear, that's when you're strongest, not when your adversaries are emboldened and not when your allies are worried you won't back them.
All right, Jamil, really nice to talk to you tonight. Really appreciate it. Very, very insightful. We'll do it again soon. Thank you so much, Jamil Jaffer, who with us on talkTV tonight. A director of the National Security Institute of the George Mason University in Washington, D.C.